Great to see you guys this morning. Missed you guys over these last few weeks as Claire and I and the family have been able to see some family across the country and have a little R&R and are excited so much to be back with you. Yesterday, we were at a wedding of the daughter of some of our oldest friends. And whenever you go to a wedding after you've been married for a while, Claire and I just celebrated in the last couple of weeks our 28th wedding anniversary. And it was, and so depending on the day, it feels like 4 years or 400, it's just, but we're at this wedding, you think about your own marriage. I was thinking back to when we got married, we registered, and I look back, Claire and I laugh about some of the things we registered for, when we got married, super young, I was 21, and you go and you just register for stuff, and you look back and you're like, that was dumb stuff to ask for. And one of the things we registered for was like the nicest comforter bedspread that you could find at the time. Because everyone needs a $700 bedspread, And when you're 21 years old, a youth pastor living in a terrible apartment. And so but someone got it for us. And so we have this epic bedspread that we then used for like 16 years. And the last 3 years of it, it was clearly on its last legs. But we knew this thing mattered, and so we hung in with it, but the time came where it was time to go, so we went to Macy's to buy a new comforter. And the thing about Macy's is they're sort of always having a sale, but if it's always a sale, it's really not a sale, but occasionally there's like the good sale, right? And so all their bedding was like 60% off, and so as we started kind of talking to this lady, she kind of says, hey, quiet voice, hey, everything here, I'll give you an additional 30%. And so now we're like doing the math, and we're like, we're bad stewards if we don't just buy a ton of bedding right now. And she's like, gave us this, like we end up getting like 85% off of everything. And it was like just one of those days. You're like, did I just get the best deal of my life? Did this lady just do something illegal? Is she potentially going to lose her job? She still works there. In fact, she still gives us some still pretty good extra deals, but never again like that one day. And where I'm like, I think she's probably potentially doing something that might be wrong, but for me right now, it feels so right. Jesus tells a story just like that. Luke chapter 16, if you have your Bibles, go over there. It's not about betting. It's not even about how awesome it can be to get a surprisingly good deal. It's about living with urgency. It's about eternity. It's about the allegiances of our hearts. We're in this series as part of our longer forever series off and on that we're in the book of Luke. We're in this little mini series looking at some of the key parables of Jesus and Luke. Luke 16, one of the weirdest parables Jesus tells. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager, there was a rich man whose manager over his possessions. I cut and pasted a piece of this verse earlier, and I cut and pasted it wrongly, and so now I'm going to read it from the screen. I was like, this is not how this verse goes. I was trying to, anyway. You guys hadn't preached in a few weeks. This could be rough for all of us. All right. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. That's the part that I cut out on accident. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be the manager any longer. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig and too ashamed to beg. A couple of things about verses 1 through 3 before we read verses 4 through 9. This Greek word here for manager, oikonomos, the word oikos speaks of house or household. Nomos was a word that would speak of management. So imagine this is the person who would be the household manager. You've got a very wealthy person, and there's no doubt other servants. So this person is in charge of the finances of the operation. They're in charge of the rest of the household staff. This is like this kind of CEO of the family, household. It was a significant operation. So this person would be this steward of the estate who had full authority to negotiate the master's household finances. A steward doesn't own anything but is responsible for everything. And so Jesus' audience would have had an understanding of this. They would have known people or known of people who would be very wealthy, who would have a person who was in charge of the household, the other servants, and the resources of the master. And this word that wasted that is used here, he says he's wasted his master's resources. It's the same word that we see in Luke 15 in a couple of weeks. We're kind of skipped ahead out of Luke 15. In a couple of weeks, we're going to kick off a series looking at Luke 15 and in depth. But at the end of Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son, where it talks about how the son squandered his father's resources. It's the same word here we see for wasted just a few verses later. So they're kind of this tie back to these previous verses. And then now we see it, verse 4. So this steward, this household manager, the chief of the household, loses his job. And so now he's like, what am I going to do? I'm too old to dig and too proud to beg. Who's felt that way before? So we see verse 4. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The master told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. He says, hey, today it's half price for you. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat. He replied to him, he said, he told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master then commended the dishonest. So then the master comes back and finds out what his household manager, who's already been wasting his resources, now he finds out that his household manager has been giving everybody discounts on what they owed the master. But instead of getting angry, he commends him. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people, and then Jesus now gives us the application for us. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. So this guy finds himself in this desperate situation. He's lost his job. And so he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to everyone that owes my master money, I'm going to give them big discounts. So then if I find myself needing a job, maybe they'll give me one. Or if I find myself homeless and needing a place to stay, maybe they'll let me stay there. Jesus now is giving us this application saying, hey, this guy acted shrewdly. He said, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. It's one of the strangest parables Jesus tells. This guy gets fired for mismanagement, and then he cooks the books in order to make sure that he'll be okay later, a place to stay or a job somewhere else. And then Jesus seems to be affirming the behavior. Some of you are like, well, hey, I've been sort of cooking the books and ripping off my boss for years. Now I feel okay about it. That's not the point of the parable. There's 4 things Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about urgency. Desperate times call for desperate measures. This guy who imagined himself working for this man, managing his household, he imagined himself doing that the rest of his life. Now he finds himself desperate. He says, man, I'm too old to take on a new career. I'm not really cut out for manual labor, but I definitely don't just want to become a beggar. What am I going to do? He finds himself in a desperate, urgent type of situation. He's been fired. He has no plan B, so he starts thinking creatively. because he's in this huge, desperate situation that demanded his full attention, and it demanded urgency. And so he responds appropriately. He recognizes the desperate, urgent situation that he finds himself in, and then he acts in light of this urgency. And so what we see is this: Jesus is not commending his dishonesty. What he's doing is he's commending his urgency and his foresight. Now, here's the thing. Most of us who still have little kids at home or have kids in college, or if you're like me, maybe you have both, 3 kids that's still at home, 2 kids in college. Most of us in that situation aren't sitting on wads of cash. And if we lost our job, we would need to find another one pretty quick. And in this culture, there was no unemployment benefits. There's no social safety net like we would think of. And so this guy recognizes, I've been living here in this large estate owned by this very wealthy man. I've been living here. I've been eating their food. I've had all of my needs met because of this job where I live, and everything comes from that. And I'm about to be homeless and jobless. I'm in this desperate situation, and it led to this urgent action. And then what Jesus says is this. He says, the people of this world understand urgency, and they understand desperation about things that matter less than the things that my followers are supposed to be thinking about. They matter temporarily, but my followers are thinking about things that matter forever. But when it comes to acting with urgent desperation, this guy, even though what he did ultimately most likely was dishonest, there are some scholars that take the perspective, and it's a minority view, that this steward who oversaw the household finances, that part of how he was paid was in charging the interest on the people. Part of the interest that was charged to people that owed this master, part of the interest was how this guy got paid. Some scholars, minority view, take the view that this guy was actually giving them this discount out. It was what was rightly due him. That is a perspective, but likely this guy's being dishonest. Jesus isn't admonishing or admiring his dishonesty or even his theft. He's admiring his urgency, that he recognizes that the stakes are high. This is a desperate thing that requires urgent action. And so Jesus says the people of this world, when dealing with temporary things like, what am I going to eat? Where am I going to live? What's going to be my job? He says they get it in many ways more than the people of the light, my followers. In some ways, they get it that they live with this desperate urgency for stuff that really doesn't matter in the light of forever. He says, but my followers sometimes don't act with desperate urgency on what's going to matter forever. And so what Jesus is saying is our spiritual life and kingdom impact deserve more urgent attention than our physical survival. That oftentimes we live with a lot of desperate urgency for stuff that really doesn't matter, but not sufficient desperate urgency for the things that matter most. It's not that we don't want to grow spiritually, and it's not that we don't want to know God more, but it's that we're not desperate about it. We're not urgent about it. When King David in the Psalms talked about his desire to really know God, he says, as the deer pants for water, that's how my soul longs for you, God. That's this language of desperate urgency. Like, man, imagine yourself just being so thirsty, or an animal being so thirsty that they're just panting for some water. David says that's the kind of desperate urgency that I have to know you. Jesus he compared it also to hunger. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And so this language of hunger and thirst, this idea of food and water, the things that we can't go without for very long at all, it's this language of desperate urgency. And so it's not that we don't want to know God more, not that we don't want to grow in our faith, but are we living with this kind of desperate urgency that this guy who finds out that he's about to be homeless and have no food supply and have no income. He comes to this moment of desperate urgency. It's not that we don't want to reach people for Jesus. It's just that we're not desperate for it. We're not urgent about it. This guy here recognizes that his survival is on the line, and so he goes into this mode of desperate urgency, and what Jesus is saying is, he says, that guy gets it more than my followers tend to get it when it comes to their own spiritual life or their own impact on the kingdom. It's a lacking of a desperate urgency, whether that's to know God more or whether that's to make our lives count for the sake of the gospel. In 1732, there were two young Moravian men, Johann Dober and David Nietzschmann. And they had heard about the enslaved Africans across the Caribbean. And they'd heard that the island of St. Thomas was considered unreachable, that it was nearly impossible to go there and gain access to these enslaved Africans for the purpose of telling them about Jesus, that the slave holders, the slave owners were notorious for not wanting their slaves to know about Jesus. And so their gospel urgency, their urgency to make their life count was so great that they were willing to sell themselves into slavery if that was the only way to reach these enslaved Africans on St. Thomas. And as their ship was sailing away, their loved ones on the shore, thinking and knowing that they would likely never again see them again in this life, these missionaries cried out. They said, "May the Lamb who was slain receive the reward of his suffering." Here's what they were declaring. If Jesus gave everything to redeem people from every nation, then we will give everything that he might receive what he died for. What we see out of those missionaries is the same kind of urgency we see out of this shrewd manager who realizes, I'm about to have nowhere to live, no food to eat, no water to drink. I'm in a desperate, urgent situation. I must take action. He tells us this weird story where it sounds like he's commending theft and embezzlement and dishonesty. He tells this weird story to wake us up that time is short and eternity is long, and it's a moment to live with urgent desperation and our quest to know God more, and in our quest to live out the purposes that he's placed in our lives to extend his kingdom. It's called to urgency. It's a call to intentionality. It's time to get strategic. See, the manager doesn't just panic. He doesn't just start crying. He doesn't just panic that he's about to be homeless and jobless and penniless and without food and water. He then devises a strategy. He says, what I'm going to do, whether it was giving out of his own commissions or whether it was what it more likely appears, actually giving out of the master's wealth, he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make as many friends as I can by being as generous as I can, so that maybe one of these folks will give me a job. Or if I find myself with nowhere to live, I go to that guy that I said, hey, remember, you owed this amount and I only made you pay this amount. Can I stay here for as long as I need to? He comes up with a strategy. He comes up with some intentionality. He makes a plan. He prepares for what's next. He has a strategy. And what Jesus says is the people of this world give more intentionality and more strategic thought about temporary things than many times the people of the light, my followers, give in terms of intentionality and strategic thought about things that are going to matter forever. Here's what Jesus wants to tell all of us, and this is a big thing for us to think about. Our spiritual life and kingdom impact deserve more strategic intentionality than our professional or financial success. That's a big deal. Maybe over these last 6 months, you've been planning for what does next year's strategic growth for the company look like? How can we increase profitability 15% next year? How can we reach the third quarter of this year's sales goals? How can I manage my investments to get a better return? And maybe you're thinking about that an awful lot. And what Jesus is saying is what kind of strategic intentionality are you putting in your quest to know me more? What kind of strategic intentional thought, what kind of plan, have you even written anything down in terms of how you're going to maximize your impact for the sake of the kingdom? It's a big thing. We spend hours strategizing for work. We spend hours even strategizing our own physical fitness, but how much strategic intentionality are we placing on how are we going to disciple our kids? How are we going to see our neighbors who don't say that they know Jesus yet? What's our strategy to build a relationship that we might ultimately have conversations about Jesus? What's my strategy to know God as much as I can, to take next steps in my journey with Him? What's my strategy to make the biggest possible impact for the glory of God and for the sake of eternity with the years I have left? What Jesus is saying is this guy came to a moment recognizing his urgent, desperate situation that led to action, but it wasn't action out of panic. He actually came up with a really good plan, a great strategy. There was some intentionality given to it. The Apostle Paul talks about how we should live. Ephesians 5, be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. Some translations go on to say because the days are evil. Other translations say because the days are short. He says, be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. And so Jesus here isn't commending this guy's dishonesty or theft. What he's saying is this guy recognized there was a moment for desperate urgency. This guy recognized it was a moment for intentional strategic thinking. And here's the thing, very few of us live with sufficient intentionality for the things that matter most. I love this Craig Rochelle quote. Everyone ends up somewhere. Few end up somewhere on purpose. When it comes to having a marriage that honors God, what kind of strategic intentionality? Do you have a plan for that? You know, Claire and I have a little plan for that. Hey, every week, best we can, we're going to spend a few hours together, just the two of us. We're going to do a date night, even if we've got to pay for a babysitter. We're going to figure this out. And about once a quarter, we're going to try to get a night away together, just the two of us. And about once a year, we're going to spend a few days away from work and away from kids and remember how much we love each other. And it's like that is a part of our intentional strategy. And I'm telling you, if you don't have a strategy to help your marriage be great, you'll wake up one day and you're just roommates waiting for the other one to die. If you laugh harder, it feels better and less true. But there's just truth to it. It takes a strategy, takes intentionality. Do you have an intentional strategy for the things that matter most? You have an intentional strategy to grow your business. You have an intentional strategy to try to get the raise or the promotion that you've been chasing. You have strategies for your investments, but the things that matter most, loving God and loving people and making maximum forever impact with your life, where's the intentional strategy? I love this story about Jeff Bezos. In the early 1990s, he was a successful executive on Wall Street. He was earning great money. But he had this idea of this online bookstore that could grow with the internet. It was an unproven concept. For years and years, Amazon lost money. It's an unproven concept. And it would require walking away from comfort and security and certainty. But to make the decision, he developed what he called the regret minimization framework. It was this. He asked himself this question: when I am 80 years old, will I regret not trying to do this? When I'm 80 years old, will I regret not trying to do this? And that question clarified everything for him. The fear of short-term failure paled in comparison to the risk of the long-term regret of inaction. So he took the leap, and Amazon was born. And the thing is this: if business people are willing to risk everything to avoid worldly regret, I mean, his worst case on Wall Street was he was going to only end up with millions. And then how would we get stuff delivered to us in 24 hours? If he hadn't done this, Claire would spend less money on Amazon because it wouldn't be an Amazon. Pray for Claire on that. It's like, why is there a package every day at our house? Oh, we need it. Do we? Anyway, that's why we spent a few days together, so I could remember I love her even with her Amazon addiction. And so, but it's like if he said his worst case was he'd make millions on Wall Street, but he stepped away and chased after this gold so he could have billions, all with this question: when I'm 80 years old, will I regret it if I don't take this step? But I would encourage you if Jesus is saying, he's saying if business people about money live with this sort of urgent desperation for stuff that doesn't matter forever, live with this level of intentional strategic action for stuff that doesn't matter forever, why don't my followers live with this sort of urgency and desperation and strategic thinking about things that will matter forever? So I'd encourage you to ask yourself this question: in 180 years, will I regret not trying to do this? In 180 years, will I regret it if I don't take some next steps of intentionality to grow in my relationship with Jesus? Maybe that looks like joining a small group in a few weeks for the first time, one of our life groups that happen all the time. Maybe that looks like buying a devotional book that you never walked your way through a devotional book, or begin reading the New Testament, or making a strategic goal, saying, hey, for the next 12 months, man, we're going to be at church live 36 times. And we're going to watch online at least 10 times. We're going to engage church one way or another 46 times. It's a goal. It's a strategy. It's some intentionality. And then what does it look like to have an intentional strategy to maximize your kingdom impact? Conversations that you're going to have a strategy with, that you're going to have conversations with people that you know that are far from God to point them towards Jesus. Maybe it looks like developing a rhythm of serving on one of our teams here. Maybe it looks like stepping out of your comfort zone, going on one of the mission trips we have coming up to Costa Rica and other places, stepping out and just doing something that you've never done before. Yesterday, a group of our interns, we work our interns as hard as we can and not feel like we're damaging them is sort of our goal. Work them hard in a good way. You get what I'm saying? Young people need that, amen? And so, for these interns on their day off, without being asked to, said, what if on a Saturday morning, 7:30, what if we met at an inner city park and brought a griddle and started making some pancakes and had someone singing some worship music, and as people gathered for the pancakes, we offered to pray for them. And so yesterday we had some of our interns on their day off, not because we asked them to, just because they wanted to. They go to an inner city park, start serving pancakes, playing some worship music, praying for people. They just stepped out of their comfort zone. What is your strategy? Your intentional strategy to take next steps in your relationship with Jesus, to take next steps to maximize your impact. I'm going to preach these next 2 points faster. Urgency, strategy, intentionality. Here's the third thing: investment. There's only one way to turn the temporary into the eternal. Luke 16:9, he says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This guy says, hey, I'm going to give everybody a great deal. Maybe I'll get a job. Maybe I can live with them. And Jesus says, that guy's on to something. He says, but don't do it like that. Don't do it by ripping people off, and don't do it just so you can be okay now. But he says there is something about using worldly or temporary wealth that you might earn, that you might gain friends, not for this life temporarily, but for forever. He says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus calls this unrighteous or worldly wealth. It doesn't mean money itself is evil, but it reminds us that it often gets tangled up in greed or pride or other things. And yet Jesus doesn't say to avoid money. He says to use it. And he says use it in a way that is echoes what this guy does for temporary selfish things. He says use it for eternal unselfish things to make eternal impact. The thing is this, he says make friends with it. He says, so when your life is over and your bank account is gone, there will be people in heaven that are there because of how you gave. He says, use this worldly, this temporary wealth that you might make eternal friends. People that you may have never met on earth, but someone who heard the good news of Jesus because of your generosity. They come to Christ, and then when you leave this life and go into the next, and then they're there, and they say, hey, we never met in that life, but I know that God used your generosity to change my forever. And you have this eternal friendship, a compassion child who ate and learned about Jesus because you sponsored them. And these are these eternal friends that this worldly temporary wealth goes on to become eternal. It's this return on investment that Jesus is pointing to, that earthly wealth can lead to eternal friendships if we steward it for the kingdom. He's not praising dishonesty. He's encouraging us to make wise, kingdom-minded investments. Because the truth is this, the only money that we keep forever is the money we give away. Randy Alcorn, in his classic book, The Treasure Principle, says you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. That's what Jesus is saying here. Use temporary wealth to make forever friends. 1 Timothy 6 is going to get skipped for the sake of time. But I want to encourage you that Jesus is saying, he said, live with urgency, live with intentionality. He says, but also live with this sense of investment in eternity. He says that just like this guy was using worldly wealth to make sure he'd have a place to stay with some friends that he made through this money, what he says is there's this thing that happens with generosity as we invest in eternal things, that we build these relationships that aren't temporary, but they are actually forever. I want to encourage you, just this summer, just the way God has used your generosity as you give to and through LifeChurch, just the way God's used your generosity. A few weeks ago, we had 61 middle schoolers, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders went to middle school camp. There were 9 of those middle schoolers who made a first-time decision to follow Jesus. Tomorrow morning, there'll be 108 high school students going to high school camp tomorrow. The next, yes, we can clap for that. Not to mention Surge Camp, where we had 650 elementary age students between our Reno and our Carson campus, many of whom made the choice to give their lives to Christ. Next Sunday, you're not going to want to miss next Sunday. Across our 3 campuses next Sunday, we've already got almost 50 people signed up to go public with baptism next Sunday alone. If that does not make you want to be excited. But here's the thing. Your generosity fuels these ministries. Eternity will be impacted. But here's the thing that Jesus is saying. The eternity impacted is not just theirs. It's ours. We are making forever friends. He says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus is giving us a whole new way of thinking. He's saying generosity isn't loss, it's investment, it's legacy. Invest in the kingdom now, and there will be eternal friends waiting to greet you in heaven. Here's the last thing, and we're done. Jesus is talking about urgency, desperation. He's talking about intentionality. He's talking about investing the temporary for the sake of the eternal. And he's talking about allegiance. Skipping down to verse 13. He says, no one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and you'll love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Bob Dylan, this song, Gotta Serve Somebody, 1979, he says, you're gonna have to serve somebody or something. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. And what Jesus here is saying is every day we gotta decide, am I gonna serve God or am I going to serve money? And N.T. Wright, I love how he says that. He says, the issue isn't whether you have money, it's whether money has you. Jesus didn't say that we shouldn't serve two masters. He says we can't. He says it's actually impossible. And the thing is, you serve what you trust in. You serve what you rely on. You serve what guides your decisions. You serve what dominates your thoughts. You serve what you make sacrifices to please for in order to please or get more of. I love how Tim Keller says it. Money flows effortlessly to that which is its God. So that there's this thing. Jesus says, hey, you got to decide, am I going to serve God or am I going to serve money? It's this allegiance issue. And so Jesus is inviting us to a different kind of life. He tells this radically strange story to give us this wake-up call to live a life of urgent desperation regarding the life or death nature of our own spiritual health and about our own kingdom impact, how we change the world for the glory of God, which leads to developing this intentional strategy, both regarding our own spiritual health and our kingdom impact, giving more thought and intention to that than we're giving to our professional or financial success, which then leads to a lifestyle of generous, joyous investment of the temporary in order to impact the eternal, which are all signs of a life of allegiance, where God matters more than money, more than success, more than career, more than anything. Let me pray for you. So, Father, I do pray that you, Lord, through your word, through your spirit, God, that the truths of this fascinating story would be more than just fascinating. But that it really would be a wake-up call that keeps us from all of the messages of the culture that would seek to lull us to sleep, that would seek to keep us from living with urgency or intentionality about the things that matter most, that would seek to keep us from investing in things that are going to last forever. All of the messages we get that would seek to make us serve and think about and worship things and money and success. But God, I pray that this story would be more than a story, but it would be a wake-up call in our hearts to live with urgency and intentionality and investment in what matters most, that ultimately that our real allegiance, the thing we live for, our passion, the thing we wake up for in the morning, the thing we think about deeply, that would be that we might love you more, that we might know you more, that we might extend your renown across the world, that we might introduce people to you, that we might extend your kingdom. And so, God, I pray that you would cause this truth to go deep into our hearts and change the way we live. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.